Okay, let's face it, with all those aviation incidents we've been seeing in the news lately, it's kind of hard not to feel a little, I don't know, uneasy when you think about, like, getting on a plane for your next trip.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you see a Delta plane flipping in Toronto,
And then you've got that midair collision in Arizona.
plus the crashes in Philadelphia and Alaska. It's definitely enough to make anyone kind of, rethink those travel plans.
For sure. It really makes you wonder about, just how safe air travel really is these days.
It's understandable that people are feeling a bit on edge, right? Especially when these incidents happen so close together. It can really shake our sense of security when it comes to flying.
Right, exactly. And that's, I think, why we're doing this deep dive today.
Yeah.
We want to really dig into the data, see what the numbers actually say about aviation safety here in the U.S.
Exactly. Sometimes, those gut feelings we have, they don't really line up with the reality of the situation. So we've got a bunch of recent reports and articles here, and we're going to, unpack all of it for you.
Absolutely. Hopefully get a little more clarity on things. So where should we start with all this?
Well, I think a good place to start is by looking at the National Transportation Safety Board, or NTSB, data. They reported 87 aviation accidents so far in the U.S., as of February 19th of this year, 2025.
Wait, really? Only 87? That number seems, I don't know, it seems pretty low considering all the headlines we've been seeing.
It does seem a bit counterintuitive, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But remember, this figure includes all types of aircraft. So, everything from those small private planes to the big commercial airliners.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, and if you compare that to the same time period last year, 2024, which saw, let's see, a total of 173 accidents in January and February, so we're actually seeing a pretty significant decrease.
Wow. Okay, that is a pretty big drop, actually. But I'm guessing the NTSB probably, categorizes these accidents in different ways, right? I mean, because a minor incident with like a small private plane, that's not the same as a major accident involving a commercial airliner, right?
You're absolutely right. The NTSB investigates and categorizes aviation accidents based on a bunch of different factors.
Uh-huh.
They look at the type of aircraft involved, of course,
Right.
the severity of the incident, and also whether there are any fatalities.
Okay, yeah. So while it's good news that the overall number of accidents is down, I think what really stays with people, what makes them nervous, are those fatal crashes.
Oh,
Those are
absolutely.
the ones that really stick with you.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we have seen several of those this year. So far, there have been 13 fatal aviation accidents in the U.S. in 2025. And that's not including, that recent collision in Arizona,
Right, right.
which which we mentioned earlier.
Yeah. I mean, thinking back to that DC collision back in January, those images were, I mean, they were really haunting.
They were.
It makes you wonder if there were like any common factors in these other fatal crashes, or like any underlying causes.
That's a really good question. And it's definitely something that NTSB is going to be investigating very thoroughly.
Uh-huh.
Each accident is unique, they're complex, but by, analyzing all the data, looking for patterns, they
Hmm.
can hopefully identify potential areas where we can, improve safety regulations or procedures.
Right, right. So let's talk a little bit about those other fatal crashes. There was the one in Philadelphia and another one in Alaska, right?
Yes, unfortunately. On January 31st, a medical aircraft crashed in Philadelphia
Oh, right.
and tragically killed all 7 people on board and one person in a car on the ground.
Wow.
And then on February 6th, a small plane crashed in Alaska, and that one claimed the lives of 10 people.
It's tough. It's a sobering reminder that even with, all the advancements in technology and safety measures that we have, these accidents can still happen.
It is. And just to kind of put things into a little bit of a global context, we should also mention those 2 big crashes that happened towards the end of last year, 2024.
Right.
One in South Korea,
Uh-huh.
which sadly resulted in hundreds of fatalities. And then there was another one in Kazakhstan with 38 deaths.
Yeah. It's a lot to take in, and I'm sure I don't know, it's probably feeding into that anxiety that a lot of people are feeling about flying right now.
It's understandable, but you know what? It's also important to remember that even with these tragic incidents, 2023 was a remarkably safe year for U.S. commercial aviation.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, there were actually 0 fatal crashes in that category.
That is encouraging to hear, especially given, all the recent incidents we've been talking about. It feels like we're, constantly bombarded with news about plane crashes.
Yeah, for sure.
It makes it seem a lot more dangerous than it actually is, I think.
Right. That's where looking at the data is so important. It really helps provide some perspective. So while, these recent incidents are definitely concerning,
Uh-huh.
let's kind of, zoom out a little bit
Yeah.
and look at the long-term trends in aviation safety.
Okay.
The Department of Transportation, or DOT, they released a report in 2024, and it highlights some interesting statistics.
Okay, let's dive into that DOT report. What kind of insights does it offer about the overall safety of air travel?
So this report, it highlights that statistically speaking, air travel is still the safest mode of transportation.
Really?
Yeah, they point out that of the 44,546 transportation-related deaths in 2022, only 2,032 of them did not involve highway vehicles.
Wow, that's a pretty stark contrast. I mean, that really puts things in perspective.
Yeah, it does.
And to add to that, the DOT report also highlighted that there were 0 deaths from large commercial airline crashes in the U.S. in 2023.
Exactly.
That's pretty amazing.
And that trend of, air travel being incredibly safe, it's further supported by a recent MIT study. They found that the global chance of dying in an airplane crash is, get this, about 1 in 13.7 million.
Wow, 1 in 13.7 million?
Yeah,
That's pretty incredible.
what is.
So, the data seems pretty clear here, right? Flying is incredibly safe.
Yeah,
But I think there's this disconnect between, those statistics and how people are actually feeling about air travel right now.
right.
If it's so safe, then why are so many people feeling anxious about it?
It's a great question. And, it really gets to the heart of how our brains process risk.
Uh-huh.
We're kind of wired, to respond strongly to dramatic events, especially when they involve like potential danger.
Right?
So even though, these crashes are statistically rare, just seeing those images on the news,
Yeah.
it triggers this powerful emotional response
Right.
that makes us feel less safe, regardless of what the data actually says.
Like if brains are telling us like, hey, this is a threat, pay attention.
Yeah, exactly.
Even if, logically we know that the odds are in our favor.
Right. It's a survival mechanism, but it can, sometimes lead us astray in our modern world,
Yeah.
especially since we have access to so much information.
Right.
And not all of it is presented in a, balanced or accurate way.
And speaking of information, the way these incidents are covered by the media, that probably plays a role in shaping public perception, too.
Absolutely. Yeah, you have the 2047 news cycle, social media, the constant need for attention-grabbing headlines. It all contributes to, this phenomenon.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily intentional fear-mongering, but just the way the information is presented
Uh-huh.
and how often it's repeated.
Right.
That can definitely skew our perception of risk.
Yeah, it's almost like those dramatic images and those headlines, they kind of hijack our rational thinking.
They do.
So, if you're someone who's got a flight coming up and you're feeling, a bit nervous about it, how do you deal with those conflicting feelings?
Mm.
On one hand, you're thinking, okay, statistically, I'm probably fine. But then there's that other voice in your head. Man, those recent crashes, those were scary.
I think it's about, finding a balance
Okay.
between acknowledging those valid concerns you have
Uh-huh.
and not letting fear, dictate your actions
Right.
based on, those skewed perceptions.
Right.
The data clearly shows that, air travel is incredibly safe,
Uh-huh.
but it's also perfectly okay to, acknowledge those feelings of anxiety,
Right.
especially given, everything that's been happening.
So it's not about like pretending you're not afraid. It's more about understanding where that fear is coming from.
Exactly.
And maybe instead of just passively accepting that fear, we can take some steps to address it, right?
Exactly.
Like be a little more proactive.
One way to do that, I think, is to focus on what's within our control.
Okay.
We can research different airlines, choose carriers with, strong safety records.
Uh-huh.
We can stay informed about, weather conditions, familiarize ourselves with safety procedures. Those are all things that can empower us as passengers.
Yeah, it's about shifting from feeling like, a helpless passenger to a more, I don't know, informed and engaged participant in the process.
Exactly. Knowledge is power.
Right.
And when it comes to air travel, understanding the facts, the risks, the safety measures in place, it can go a long way in easing anxiety and, making the experience more enjoyable.
Yeah, I love that, going from helpless passenger to informed participant.
Yeah,
It takes away that feeling of, being at the mercy of fate.
right.
It puts some of that control back in our hands.
Exactly.
And speaking of control, one thing that I think often gets overlooked is the role of, regulatory bodies
Uh-huh.
in ensuring aviation safety. Here in the U.S., we have the Federal Aviation Administration, or the FAA,
Yeah,
and they set these like rigorous safety standards for airlines, pilots, aircraft maintenance, all that. So
exactly.
they're kind of like the watchdog, right? Making sure everyone is playing by the rules and, putting safety first.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah,
They have strict regulations for, everything from pilot training, flight hours to, aircraft inspections, maintenance procedures.
right.
And they don't hesitate to take action against airlines that don't meet those standards.
Okay, that's reassuring to know. So it's not just, hoping that the airlines are going to prioritize safety.
Right.
There's an actual governing body, with some teeth enforcing those standards.
That's right. And the U.S., is known for having some of the strictest aviation safety regulations in the world.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, and that definitely contributes to our strong safety record.
Okay, that makes sense. But we've been talking a lot about the U.S. here.
Uh-huh.
And I know you mentioned earlier that, aviation safety standards can vary around the world.
Right.
So what about those of us who might be traveling internationally?
That's a great point. While the U.S. has this high bar for aviation safety, not all countries have the same level of oversight or regulations.
Right, so how can travelers find out more about those international safety standards, if they're planning a trip overseas?
Well, there are several reputable organizations that specialize in, evaluating aviation safety globally.
Okay,
One of the best known is the International Air Transport Association, or IEDA.
okay.
They have this comprehensive safety audit program
Uh-huh,
that assesses airlines and aviation authorities around the world.
right.
They look at everything from operational procedures to pilot training to aircraft maintenance, the whole nine yards.
So if someone's planning, an international trip, checking out IAD's website, seeing how their chosen airline stacks up,
Yeah.
that'd be a smart move.
Absolutely. It provides, valuable insight into an airline's commitment to safety and whether they're, adhering to those international standards.
Okay, good to know.
Another organization worth mentioning is the Airline Ratings website.
Oh, okay.
They offer an independent safety rating system
Uh-huh.
that takes into account, things like crash records, audits by governing bodies, fleet age, that kind of stuff.
It's great that these resources exist. It takes away that feeling of, I'm just booking a flight and hoping for the best. You can actually do your research
Yeah.
and make an informed decision.
Right, exactly. And I think that's a key takeaway here.
Hmm.
When it comes to air travel, being an informed passenger, that's empowering. Understanding the data, the risks, and the safety measures that are in place, it allows us to, make more informed choices and approach flying with a greater sense of confidence.
Right. It's about replacing, that blind fear with informed awareness,
Exactly.
which leads to better decisions, right? And ultimately, a more enjoyable travel experience.
Well said. And it's not just about, individual travelers. The aviation industry as a whole is constantly innovating and implementing new technologies
Uh-huh.
to enhance safety, even further.
Right.
So, for example, a lot of airlines are now using advanced collision avoidance systems, real-time weather tracking,
Wow.
predictive maintenance tools, all to identify and mitigate, potential risks.
That's amazing. It sounds like the industry is really, proactive about staying ahead of the curve when it comes to safety.
They are, and I think that's, an important message to get across. This isn't a static industry resting on its laurels.
Right.
There's this continuous drive to improve, to learn from past incidents, and to make, air travel as safe as humanly possible.
Well, this conversation has definitely given me a new perspective on aviation safety. I feel a lot more informed now,
I'm glad to hear that.
and less anxious about about my upcoming flight.
Remember, knowledge is your best travel companion.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's really interesting how technology is constantly evolving to make flying safer. But even with all these advancements, I think there's still that human element, right? Our psychology, when it comes to how we view risk.
Oh, for sure. Definitely. We've talked about it a bit, but it's worth really emphasizing. Our survival instincts, those deep down things, they can really affect our judgment even when the data tells a different story.
Yeah, yeah. It's like that saying, what is it? One death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. We can wrap our heads around the stories from those crashes, but the huge number of safe flights, that's harder to picture emotionally.
You got it. That's exactly it. And it doesn't help that the media often portrays these events in a certain way. You see those, really vivid images and dramatic headlines,
Right, right.
and those things stick with us. They create this exaggerated idea of how risky it really is.
Yeah. So how do we, as travelers who want to be informed, how do we balance those feelings? Like, how do we acknowledge those fears that we have while also remembering that flying is, statistically speaking, very safe?
I think it's about finding that middle ground between being aware and overreacting. So yeah, be aware of the risks, but don't let them stop you from doing things or make you make travel choices based on just fear.
So it's not about pretending that nothing bad ever happens.
Right.
It's about looking at the whole picture, understanding the statistics, and then using that to make good decisions.
Exactly, exactly. And it's also about, remembering that we can affect our own safety too. Choosing good airlines, staying up to date on weather, being familiar with the safety stuff they talk about, those are all things that make us safer and less stressed travelers.
Yeah, yeah. It's empowering when you realize you're not just along for the ride. You can actually do things to be safer.
That's it. And beyond what we do ourselves, it's also important to realize that the entire aviation industry is constantly working to improve safety standards.
You were talking about those technology things earlier, like collision avoidance and predictive maintenance. What are some other things the industry's doing to reduce risk?
Well, pilot training is a big thing and ongoing education too. So they have simulations training that happens regularly and they evaluate pilots really thoroughly. All that ensures that pilots know what to do in a lot of different situations.
So it's not just about having all the fancy technology, right?
No, definitely not.
It's about having people who are really good at what they do.
Absolutely. The human element is still so important, and the industry gets that. And of course, there's all the data they get from, past incidents too. The NTSB and other organizations, they study every accident in detail to figure out what happened and how to prevent it from happening again.
It's like they're always learning and adapting and, getting better.
Exactly, exactly. They never stop working to improve safety. And that's actually a good thing, I think. It means they're not sitting back and thinking everything's fine.
Right.
They're committed to making flying as safe as it can possibly be.
Yeah. Well, we've talked about a lot today, everything from those feelings we get when we think about flying to the statistics that are actually really reassuring and the new technology and how hard the industry is working to improve. So thinking about all that, what would you say to someone who's feeling anxious about their next flight? What's the most important thing to remember?
I think the biggest takeaway is those feelings you have, they make sense, but statistically, flying is still super safe. And the industry is always trying to make it even safer. So just take a deep breath, trust the data, and think about the things you can do yourself to be safer.
That's great advice. So to everyone listening, the next time you see one of those headlines about, something happening with an airplane, think about what we talked about today. Don't let fear run the show. Take a deep breath, trust the process, and enjoy the flight.
And remember, knowledge is your best travel companion.
I love it. Well, this deep dive has been really insightful. Thanks for exploring this with us today.
Happy to be here.
And to all you amazing listeners out there, until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.